So, thank you everyone for joining me for another episode in which I talk about issues relating to public transportation. And I'm going to talk about an issue that I literally just blogged about accessibility. So I urge people to read my blog post. It is called Notes on Accessibility and Chronic Pain. Uh, but it's not going to be just me reading blog posts. Rather, it's going to be issues about what I think good standards for accessibility are, and I want to talk more about the issues relating to universal design. Uh, and I kind of want to make it clear to people that what I'm going to say is something that is, let's call it innovative but not earth-shattering. So what do I mean by innovative but not earth-shattering? This is not what people who passed disability access laws 30 years ago were thinking about. Um, but it's also not something that I'm inventing or something that has been invented last year. This is something that, so the concept of universal design was first explained to me by someone named Laura Brailsford. Laura Brailsford is the Assistant General Manager of System-Wide Accessibility at the MBTA. Now, the United States, and to make it very clear, the United States is not on the frontier of public transit, but it's not like a backwater when it comes to accessibility, which is only it's a frontier of accessibility. Americans exaggerate the extent to which the United States is better at accessibility than other places, but uh, the MBTA specifically has done decently well on this. Um, so it's not like if the MBTA is doing it, it means that it's been known for 50 years or anything. No, it's not. But it's something that's relatively new. But it's sufficiently established that agencies hire people in senior roles who do this, and these people promulgate the way that they think about accessibility. Um, so, what does universal design mean? Essentially means doing a kind of design that is uh, aiming to work for everyone, as opposed to trying to segregate away people with disabilities. So I'm going to shrink myself because I am okay. So I'm going to shrink myself because I need to possibly show some things on the internet, and I promise that I will actually not be as technologically dumb. Okay. So. Uh, The United States has something called paratransit. Uh, Not everywhere has it. I know that Singapore has some paratransit. I do not know to what extent it exists here. If it does, so it's something that's always kind of marginal. And the United States, it's also marginal, but it's always lurking out there, and every agency will say about anything. Oh well, that affects paratransit. So paratransit is a system in which it is assumed that people with disabilities do not have the means of traveling by themselves on public transport, and therefore they require special accommodations. The special accommodations being a special van that that they book in advance. So they're saying, okay, I need to go from where I live to, I don't know, wherever, to the hospital, for example, to get medical care. And the van system says, okay, show up. We will come pick you up from your place in this half-hour window. Be ready. And when I'm saying half-hour window, literally, this is how it works in the United States. You get a half-hour window, and you have to book at least a day in advance. So it's not spontaneous. It's essentially a really bad taxi service that's designed to be accessible. So the vehicles have deployable ramps, they have enough space. And the rule is that they charge comparable fares to public transit. I do not remember the US law, so let me actually check. So ADA paratransit fares. I don't remember if the rule is that you're only allowed to charge the exact same fares as normal public transit, or up to twice. So you can read literally what it put. It's premium charges for paratransit services, and I'm going to leave this online for a sec though if people want to copy paste or something. I mean, you can't copy paste; it's static, but you can again just put ADA paratransit fares. It's going to give you this. So I'm not going to read this entire bureaucracies, but the point is that they uh, treat this so they treat this as something for people who are assumed incapable of independent mobility. And the ADA, so this is an American law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's from about 30 years ago. And what the ADA says is that every public transit agency is required to operate paratransit unless it is commuter rail. And note, the law does not say you are required to operate paratransit if the system is inaccessible. No, the law says in the United States you are required to operate paratransit. So if you make the entire subway system accessible, that is irrelevant. Or if you make the entire bus system accessible, and at this point, bus systems tend to be accessible. So generally, every bus is at least in theory wheelchair accessible, and the newer ones are also accessible in practice. So, for example, the New York City buses that I rode 15 years ago, some of the older ones, so these would be things that so bus in the United States last 12 years. So I moved to New York in '06, and it's something that I saw in '06 or '07. And these were even then the older buses. So these buses have not been in service for at least 10 years. They had this thing where they were high floor buses, and there was a wheelchair ramp, but it wasn't a ramp; it was a lift, and it was in the back, and it was essentially impossible to maneuver independently. People in wheelchairs hated these. Some still use them, but they did not consider these to be accessible. But again, the newer buses, first they had the lift in the front, which was a little bit better, I believe, and then they went low floor, and low floor had a deployable ramp, but it's easier to maneuver around. And so the buses in New York are at this point accessible. The subway is not, but again, I said MBTA before. In Boston, I believe there are two inaccessible subway stops. They're both very marginal to the system. One of them, Bowdoin, might actually be closed. It's under constant closure threat because of the possibility of the red blue connector. It's also very close to Government Center, which is like all other non-Bowdoin, non-Boston stops accessible. So, even if the system is accessible in the United States, you are required to operate paratransit, and the rule is that you're required to you're required to offer service to anywhere. It has to be door to door, I believe. Anywhere within 3/4 of a mile, so 1.2 kilometers of any transit stop. And some states elect to even go further. Massachusetts says that it's not just within 3/4 of a mile, but in every town served by the system. So if your buses stop in a municipality, so let's say a certain suburb of Worcester or Springfield has buses, then the same agency is required to operate paratransit throughout in a service area that consists of the entire municipal limit. And this is abused actually. A lot of suburbs of Springfield hate the buses because they consider the buses to be dirty, black, poor, and criminal. And so, or rather, they consider bus riders to be dirty, black, poor, and criminal. They don't say this. They're not. It's woke racism. But that's what they think. And And so they do not want buses serving their towns, but they sometimes want to get one bus stop somewhere within the municipal limits so that they can trigger ADA mandates. So a lot of this is, first of all, very legalistic, very adversarial. So the idea is that life is a struggle, everything is a struggle, everything will always be a struggle. You have to have a lawyer by your side for any kind of interaction. That's kind of the mentality of this kind of American paradigm. There's also a mentality, which is not purely American, that people with disabilities need constant help and therefore cannot be expected to independently move. And this is where you're seeing paratransit mandates. And I need to make something very clear. Paratransit, so portrayed as a kind of really bad taxi service because it's you need to book a day in advance and you get a half hour window. And yeah, I imagine you're going to be tardy by a couple of minutes when you're called and said, "Come down now." But this also means that all the people on the way, it's not a private shuttle. There are going to be other people, and they're also going to be late, so it's going to take forever, and it's humiliating. And uh, let me see if I can actually find the exact thing here. So it's called demand response uh, in American parlance. So let's, for example, look at New York City Transit. So let's look at the operating expenses and the fare revenues. So the operating expenses are pretty easy to divvy. The fare revenues are kind of notional, but you might notice something, which is that paratransit costs New York City Transit $500 million a year, which is an appreciable fraction. Second order, but an appreciable fraction of its operating costs. And it essentially generates no fares. Uh, and it essentially generates no ridership. So the ridership look is called unlinked trips. Now, unlinked trips are a rather wonky number because it means that if I change trains or change buses, then I count as two trips, which is especially silly when you look at the subway because the subway is very transfer heavy and you don't even have to, let's say, swipe a second time when you change between lines. So this number is 2.7 billion. This is not the ridership on New York City on the New York City subway. The actual ridership is more like 1.7. But buses, it's again, it's less seamless. Very few people actually transfer bus to bus. Paratransit is supposed to be door to door, so it's about 5 million riders, about $500 million in operating expenses. Yeah, these people cost $100 a pop. And passenger miles, okay, so it's kind of longish trips, 9-ish miles. That's 14 kilometers. That's not why it costs $100. Remember that the JFK taxis in New York? Um, I forgot how much they cost now. JFK taxi fare. Um, okay, they're saying 52. The number that I remember was 55. Um, and also right now it's kind of weird because of Uber competition and because Corona. The number that I remember is 55, but the point is that JFK to Manhattan is lower uh, than this, overcharges tourists, and costs half as much, and the taxis cost half as much to operate. Is the bus with completely unusable routing that is, yeah, no. So funny. It's a really good question. There, in addition to these, certain buses that exist as this kind of paratransit in all but name. I don't know if such buses exist in Boston, but there are a handful of examples in New York. Um, but um, but it's not quite paratransit. So there are buses that are almost as bad as paratransit. There's the bus that crosses Williamsburg Bridge, just one side to the other. There are subway stops there's a subway line across the bridge. There are subway stops at both ends. The bus doesn't serve anything the subway doesn't. It's just that the subway does not have elevators. And it's a very low ridership bus. There's a higher ridership bus that actually we were talking about possibly killing in the Brooklyn bus redesign. In the event the subway became more accessible. So there are buses that exist as overlays on top of subway lines that have a reason to exist in part because of inaccessibility, but it's something very different. Because the bus also because so it's only zoom in on Fulton Street for a moment. That's the bus that it's I believe it's called the B25. Uh, so unfortunately, I'm not gonna use the pretty graphics that Juliet Eldred, aka Numtalk, made, but rather the bad graphics that are on Google Earth because they're infinitely zoomable. So this street, so not so there, so this street has a black line over it, which indicates there's a mainline railway in there. This is the LIRR. It's called Atlantic. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the block one to the north. So this was historically the main road. So this is where they built the railway. The railway was not useful for urban travel, so they went on a parallel line. They had an L here pretty early, and then the L was replaced by a subway in I want to say the 1940s. Uh, and this is called Fulton Street. Uh, the A and C trains run here, so this is one of the so it's a four-track subway. There is a bus on here. Uh, I believe it is numbered B25. And you notice that on this map, there's no such bus. There's no bus on Fulton on our map. Why? Fulton is not a horrifically weak route. It's not a great route, but it's not horrifically weak. But there's a subway underneath, and buses and subways should work in complement and not in competition. But the buses are accessible, and I don't think any of these stops, or maybe only one of them, is accessible. And I think what we said in the report is that we're assuming that the accessibility program that Andy Byford is pushing is going to make more of these accessible, and then it's just a moving target based on on how many stops have step-free access. But here we're already getting into something that's not quite the idea of dependence, because universal design means that everyone uses the same system. So this means that you have the normal subway system, but there's going to be an elevator at every station so people can actually use it. Uh, Wait, what do you mean what the non-alone person is saying? This? So bear in mind, legally these are not paratransit. But again, remember, paratransit is, despite being a deluxe experience as far as the government is, who has to pay it is concerned, is from the perspective of the user, a horrifying, humiliating mess. It's so bad that some enterprising local governments in the United States figured out that they can save money on not having to pay $100 per person by contracting with Uber and Lyft to use accessible vehicles. Not all vehicles are accessible, but enough are that they could do it, and use them for paratransit. So if you have, so you get a voucher and you can use it to use an Uber or a Lyft to your destination within the service area. And the problem is that because the experience stopped being humiliating, even though the costs per rider fell dramatically. Uber does not cost $100 to operate per trip, even a long trip. The so despite that, so even though the operating costs fell, I don't even know by what factor. I imagine it could be a full order of magnitude. Ridership skyrocketed because suddenly this was not um because suddenly it was not hell, and so they had to spend more money on subsidizing this. Uh, so this is uh, so anyway, this is the answer to your question, Tony. I mean, so a bus, unless it is paratransit, it is not paratransit in American law. And remember, even if the system is fully accessible, it required to operate it because it's how people thought 30 years ago. Now, today people think better. And then whenever I try to extend universal and try to explain, okay, this is how we can avoid needing paratransit, people, it's one of these things that when I say, okay, so now we can abolish paratransit, and then people stare at me like I'm a lunatic because you're only supposed to accrete more rules, you're never supposed to remove them. But universal design fundamentally means that things are just going to work for large groups of people. And this especially means that anyone might need to use accommodations, and not just people with extensive disabilities. So the standard example of this is, again, so the symbol of disability is the wheelchair, right? I mean, you go to a bathroom, you see a silhouette standing with legs, with two parallel legs. That means male. You see a silhouette standing with something that looks like a dress. It means female. You see an icon of a wheelchair. That means accessible bathroom. That's the universal symbol. Um, so for people in wheelchairs, what they need is step-free access, which is not how subways were historically built, right? Subways were historically built so that you would go downstairs to access the platform, or maybe you would use an elevator, not an elevator, maybe you'd use an escalator if the platform is deeper. Now, elevators were very rare. So the deep lines of the London Underground were historically accessible by elevators. The problem is that but first of all, they were never accessible. I think you went downstairs one flight and then you took the elevator. Second, elevators are very low capacity. So when things are long enough, they're fast. They're faster than anything else, which is what you're seeing in, say, skyscrapers. But escalators are much higher capacity. So if you go to a shopping mall, expects very large volumes of traffic. It wants to me. I mean, maybe it also wants you to go floor by floor to see all the shops. So it's going to be with escalators, and likewise public transport. When it wants you to change elevation, it will use escalators, and escalators are not wheelchair accessible. But there are other things. Uh, yeah, but um, there are other things that you might need to use an elevator for, even if you're not disabled. So I lived for 2 years and 3 months in a lovely little apartment in a very not lovely old building, uh, which is literally this one. This one, my apartment was here. Not physically, I'm not indicating the floor, but this is where my apartment was. So pink, and this is Nation. Now, none of the Paris metro is accessible except Metro Line 14 because French people hate people with disabilities. But the RER in the city is. So uh, there was an elevator here that took me direct to the RER, to one level above the RER platform. There was an escalator onto the platform, very easy. And then I would be able to just take it to Le Havre and then maybe to the airport. Now, the airport as a destination requires step-free access, or at least escalator access, because effectively everyone who flies with luggage. And then, whenever the elevator was out for maintenance, which did happen once, and I had to go downstairs, only it took me something like 7 minutes longer just to access the platform. Uh, because of how labyrinthine this complex is and how difficult uh, dragging a large suitcase is down multiple flights of stairs. And and so this is an example of universal design with luggage. Now, luggage is something you can use with escalators, but there are other things where it's harder. For example, prams, strollers. And so prams, you can probably carry on an escalator as well, but it's very inconvenient, and many people who use strollers use elevators. So on the U-Bahn in Berlin, within a few years, every station is going to have an elevator. Right now, only I think 2/3 or 3/4 of the stations have elevators. I sometimes use the elevators. Sometimes they're just closer to where I'm going than the stairs. Sometimes I have heavy luggage, and now the Berlin U-Bahn is not the tube in London. The tube was built deep. The U-Bahn was mostly built shallow, so there were stairs, no escalators. So if you're trying to retrofit a station from the 1920s with accessible infrastructure, yeah, you will just add an elevator, and then people who have luggage are going to use the elevator. I use that to move. I use that to move. I use it to buy a mattress to move a mattress from where I was buying the mattress to my apartment. And so so everyone might need this kind of infrastructure. And and in Berlin, uh, I can tell you who uses the elevators on the U-Bahn because I use the U-Bahn, right? And the S-Bahn. It's usually not people in wheelchairs. So people in wheelchairs do use the elevators. They do get on the trains, and they do access the platforms using the elevators. But most people who use the elevators on the U-Bahn and the S-Bahn are able-bodied. They might have strollers. They might have luggage. Again, they might just be using it because it's closer or something. And this is, I think, a key insight of how accessibility works, how people think about accessibility in the 21st century. In terms of, first of all, you design the infrastructure for multiple purposes. And this means that you look for solutions that can have multiple purposes. So the elevator is a really good example because it means that instead of spending $100 per trip on paratransit, you're going to have an elevator which costs a certain amount of money in capital. It is on the order of, I think, $2 million/euros per elevator that you need. In Berlin, you only need one because we have island platforms. Most systems would need three because there's a mezzanine and then two platforms. So Madrid actually spends more. So Madrid has very low construction costs, but they actually spend more per station on accessibility than Berlin does. Not because the costs in Madrid per elevator are higher, but because they need three and we need one. Um, so yeah, you spend maybe 2 million euros, let's say, per elevator. So that would be in the situation of Madrid, which is also about to be 100%. In Madrid, they would need something like 5 or 6 million euros per remaining station. We need, I think, 2 million. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's elderly people do that as well. So elderly people always live in this kind of liminal zone, and I do not know to what extent the people who think about universal design think about liminality. Um, it is very logical that they would, because this kind of postmodern thinking about oppression and social marginality is very important within civil rights jurisprudence, and uh, and so it's very plausible to me that the people who came up with the idea of universal design did this as a way of avoiding modernist ideas of hard boundaries and understanding people in the liminal zone, people who are, let's say, mildly disabled, but maybe don't have any piece of paper to prove it because of medical discrimination, or maybe they're elderly and maybe they're able-bodied by the standard of someone who is 70, but they're still 70. As opposed to, let's say, people who use wheelchairs, or people who use walkers, people who even use canes. So maybe something that's not very, maybe something that's not very visible. And I bring up this liminality because, yeah, if you're my age, then yeah, you can carry a bag of very heavy groceries up and down stairs on an inaccessible subway station, but it gets a lot less convenient at twice my age. Uh, and Yeah, exactly. And but that's not true. I mean, the understanding there is that you can use the wheelchair infrastructure as long as you make space for people who actually need it. Um, I have sometimes used accessible bathrooms if there was nobody else around in places where bathrooms were male, female, or accessible. Uh, and so the but the situation is that everything should be for everyone's use. And again, it's understanding that there are people in the liminal zone. There are people who are not liminal at all, but have special circumstances that would make them need this kind of special accommodations for just now. In this case, it would be that. In this case, it would be that maybe they're again heavy luggage, or maybe they have a strollers are harder than heavy luggage because heavy luggage you can just like drag downstairs, and it's much easier to do it for um, uh, a six pack of water than for a baby. Uh, and the upshot is that when you think this way, again, you think about what infrastructure can be used for other people. So again, spend the 2 million euros per station on an elevator. Again, maybe not 2 million stations per, not 2 million per station, 2 million per elevator. So let's say 6 million per station, and then that's for the scale. I think Madrid can actually go full accessible for a couple 100 million euros, and this is why they're doing it. Berlin, because we only need one elevator for very low hundreds of millions. Maybe the first digit is a one or something, as opposed to again just spending lots and lots of money on providing substandard service. And that's also true in other cases of what accommodations you're providing. So what about, let's say, blind people? Um, so blind people are not invisible, by which I mean I don't mean literally in the sense of invisibility. So I mean um, the mainstream social conception of what disability is. Again, it centers the wheelchair, but blind people are a protected class. Specifically, the ADA requires things to be accessible to blind users. And it's not just the ADA, it's like the kind of emerging global standards of accessibility include things like tactile strips. So, so you know when you're at a subway, the edge of the platform is not just a normal concrete slab, right? Let me see if I can find tactile platform. It's called tactile pavement. Yes, this. So this is tactile at a parking lot. But and note that there's also a cut here, like a curb cut that lets that maybe it's unclear by perspective, but there's a step here, like it's this color. So if you're in a wheelchair, you're probably not going to go. You're going to go. And the tactile pavement, first of all, indicates to a blind user that this is a change in surface, and beyond this, there's a roadway. Uh, and if it were a subway stop, it would not look like this. It would be this would be flat. It's just that this would be a tactile strip. Uh, Again, this is there to inform blind users that this is the end of the platform. But first of all, for people in wheelchairs, it's also important as a stop. If you have a four-wheel roller, this will also stop the roller. You do not want your suitcase accidentally falling onto the track. Uh, Corners, yes. The answer is yes, but I'm going to get to that in a little bit. The answer is yes, but it's not for the reasons you think. Uh, and what about people who are not very alert? Okay, I mean, I am just wandering around, mostly. At this point, I would be arguing with people on Twitter, but but let's say I live in Canada, I didn't have Wi-Fi there. I mean, I had internet at home. I just didn't have a Canadian phone that I would be able to use, so I would be playing whatever games I could on my phone. So if I'm just being absent-minded, then this alerts me, oh wait, don't stray. Or if uh, um, or if I am disabled, but my disability is not blindness or wheelchair, or need to use a wheelchair, but rather it is some kind of difficulty with alertness. Like let's say I have seizures, and only I just or let's say that I just let's say that I'm confused. Let's say out of some kind of dementia or senility in general. Then all of these prevent me from accidentally wandering onto the track. This is really important. Um, and so this is something that's useful for very large classes of people who use it for different purposes, either as a cue uh, or as a stop. But it's useful for a variety of groups. And the standards are, of course, such that even though this is a bump that if you're on purpose, that you can cross within a wheelchair on purpose, just not by accident. So it's this kind of safety mentality. Or here is something else that uh, is being required, but is not being required well. So it is required in at least American and Canadian disability law that all stop announcements on the bus be made audibly. So a bus driver is legally required to announce the name of every stop for blind users. Uh, but so this is, I think, imperfect universal design. Why? Because the bus driver um, might not be very understandable, right? I mean, it's going to go over a noisy channel, which is the bus. The driver sits in the front, the users are behind. The driver is chosen for skills like being able to drive a bus, being very alert, being sober. But bus drivers are never chosen for how clearly they enunciate or whether they have a standard accent. And it's quite common, in fact, that essentially anywhere where you have uh, ethnic or class-based accents, the bus drivers will not be speaking the standard accent because the standard accent is middle class. And so if you're a foreign learner, you might not understand the language very well and you might not hear what the bus driver is saying very well. So this is where computerized announcements are really useful because they're just clearer. So what does this mean that they're clearer? It means that blind users can understand, do bus drivers announce stop signs. In uh, Toronto, they are, I believe that in Canada and the United States, they are required to, and if, so it's either the bus driver has to announce every stop or there's going to be a pre-recorded computer announcement. And my claim is that the pre-recorded version is better. Why? Because it is clearer. So it's first of all clearer to the user who needs to know when to get off. Maybe I'm riding the bus and it's not my regular route, and so I need to know when to get off. Uh, Maybe I just don't speak the language very well, and so my accent comprehension is imperfect, and a computerized voice that enunciates clearly in the standard accent is more comprehensible. Maybe I'm blind. Maybe I'm hard of hearing, but not yet deaf. And that also militates in favor of computerized enunciation. So this is something that so it is not required for there to be a computer voice. Yeah, doing it live would be crazy. Yeah. Pre-recorded or synthesized could be work. It could work either way, but it needs to be again very clear. It needs to be clear enough that a user who speaks the language poorly should be able to get it. Now, universal design is a maxim about disability, but it is something that can also be used in this case for people who speak the language poorly, uh, who could be, and again, these already fall into a bunch of different classes, right? Because they can be immigrants or they can be tourists. And immigrants and tourists don't use the system in the same way. Because if it's an immigrant who speaks the language poorly, then probably they live in an enclave. And so the way they use the system probably is specific to like the line to the enclave maybe, and this is something that you can exploit sometimes. So in New York is probably the so I think New York is actually the best example of this. Maybe Toronto is also, I'm not sure, but in so the thing about New York is it is first of all an incredibly diverse city. And second of all, it is an incredibly segregated city. So there are specific neighborhoods where you expect Chinese people who do not know any English. Uh, so you expect people who do not know any, so you expect Chinese speakers who do not know any English to be using specific stations, specific lines. And at these stations, sometimes they also have Chinese posters. They don't do the announcements in Chinese ever. The announcements in New York are English only. Now in Asia, they do this better. In Asia, there's a tendency to do multilingual announcements, and there's also an Asian tendency to number the stations, which I think is really important. And again, this is again an example of universal design because it helps an occasional user orient themselves better because an occasional user can memorize the station that they need to go to. But if the station that I need to go to is Oslo Straße, and I'm at Gesundbrunnen, I need to remember whether Gesundbrunnen and I hear Gesundbrunnen. I need to remember whether I still need to go or whether I've gone too far and I need to go back because I don't know what Gesundbrunnen is and what Oslo Straße is if I'm uh, an occasional visitor to the city. And if it's numbered, it's much easier to remember the number of the station. And this is again something that Asia does and Europe doesn't, and Europe needs to learn this, and North America needs to learn this. It's something that I imagine they do in Asia better because in Asia they expect the non-language speaker or the tourist to not just be a poor user of the language, but to be illiterate, right? Because the scripts are different. The language is also very different. I mean, it's kind of expected that if you're a European tourist in Europe, I mean, nowadays we can use English, but even, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago, it was expected that you would know a little bit of the language or a little bit of English, and the people you would communicate with would know a little bit of your language, perhaps, or a little bit of English. Um, Yeah, exactly. And if it's yeah, exactly. Even if it's a unfamiliar neighborhood, I mean, I don't remember how many stops there are between Oslostrasse and Gesundbrunnen. Um, I lived near Bernauer Straße. I lived literally 2 stops from Gesundbrunnen. I would go to Gesundbrunnen all the time for groceries. I still sometimes go to Gesundbrunnen. I do not remember how many stops there are between Oslo Strasse, which is to the north of Gesundbrunnen, and Gesundbrunnen. I believe it is. I can check this just out of curiosity, but because I don't, but numbering means that I can see. Okay, I need to go to again. Let's say it's Oslo Strasse, and let's count it south to north because this will never be extended to the south. There's no point. So this is 1, 5, 8. So I know that I live at stop number 8 on U8. And then, okay, Alexanderplatz is 10. Okay, 13, 15. Oh, I need to get to stop 17. I remember also Strasse is stop 17. Okay, time to go. It's just much, it's just much clearer this way. And again, it's much more legible to people who don't know the language at all and can't even read the script, which is again absolutely a thing in East and in Southeast Asia. It is useful for immigrants who don't know the language at all. which is not a common situation because immigration um, usually has been within the very broad Western world. So most immigrants to a European, I want to say that most immigrants to an arbitrarily selected European country are European, but this was certainly true 20 years ago. I don't know if it is still true. Um, and in the United States, excuse me, most immigrants, I think maybe even today, but certainly up until 15 years ago, most immigrants spoke European language. So in the United States, people don't think of Hispanics as white people. They don't think of Hispanics as culturally Western necessarily. Samuel Huntington, always a pleasure, wrote an entire book complaining that you cannot have the American dream in Spanish and be Catholic, and you have to anglicize and be Protestant. But Hispanics speak, by definition, Spanish. They are literate in the Latin script. And so numbers again are somewhat useful for them, but clear announcements will probably be enough. However, Chinese people are different. Chinese people, if they don't know the language, they don't know the language. There's an ethnography that I referenced in the thing that I wrote for the FDA about Title VI, which is the civil rights access law. They were asking about people with limited English proficiency. They were asking adversarial questions about how to mandate more community outreach. And I said, let's not do community outreach. Let's just do guidelines. Here are some guidelines. Here's an ethnography. You should be reading about how how monolingual Chinese immigrants use the subway in New York. They circle the first letter of each station as a memorization thing because this is on the 7. It's on the 7 train, and the 7 is and the stations on the 7 are partly numbered, but not all of them. So you need to know this. So like you want clear directions. So things like northbound and southbound, as opposed to going to Wittenau or to Hermannstrasse, which if you which let's say that, and I'm saying let's say it literally happened. I went to a game. I believe I went to Berlin. I believe I arrived in Berlin on a Tuesday, and I on Thursday went to a game night, and on the way back, I did not remember which way I needed to go north to my home, whether I need to go to Wittenau or to Hermannstrasse. Now, this is a literally fresh off the train thing. I mean, I got it wrong, and then I backtracked and got it right, and then I remembered, okay, north is to Wittenau, south is to Hermannstrasse, but it is useful to go north, to say northbound or southbound for the tourist, for example, right? Because I mean, 2 days in the city is pretty common for a tourist. I made the same mistake in Milan, by the way, when I visited many years ago. And yeah, you don't want people to count stops because people will make mistakes. You want this to be useful for people who are not very alert. You want this to be useful for people um, with mental degeneration, like again, like dementia, or people who are just confused. You want this to be useful for people who are deaf, for people who are blind. Sometimes I mean, there are people who are deaf blind. It's just that people who are deaf blind, like very little stuff is accessible to people who are deaf blind. There are very special things for this, and this is where you're getting into things like into how it took like some special like the part where they were like where Helen Keller's teacher had to like sign like doll on her arm, the but for people who are not deaf blind but are deaf or blind but not both, there are um, tools, and the point is to communicate information in a bunch of over a bunch of channels at once. So you want again, so you want the numbers, you want clearly audible announcements, never live voice, always pre-recorded, maybe synthesized, I'm not sure. You want Um, you maybe want to have visually distinct stations. This is useful. So in Mexico City, they have visually distinct stations. And the reason is that when the system was built in the they started, I believe, in the 1960s, there was still widespread illiteracy. So you want to be accessible to the illiterate, but it's not. But I mean, obviously, you're not just gonna. So first of all, maybe in the 1960s you couldn't just pre-record announcements or anything, but more importantly, you want to also use this to make the stations nice. So they also make the station kind of artistic. I mean, you don't want to splurge on this, but station art costs very little. Um, I think it adds maybe 1% of the cost, if that, so third order. Um, can a guide dog figure out a stop? Yes, but I don't know how reliably. So let me check if actually. So there are dogs that train themselves to uh, use the Moscow metro. Uh, so from time to time, you read these articles about the dogs on the Moscow metro that they can identify what station to get off at based on. I'm forgetting what. So they're using auditory cues. I don't know if they managed to memorize some kind of musical sound or some kind of. I think Moscow Metro might be playing a different jingle at each stop, or maybe they just managed to memorize a phoneme in the same way that dogs can be trained to respond to verbal orders. Yeah, the stray dog can only do it in the part they're used to, so it's not something that a guide dog can do arbitrarily, as far as I can tell. Dogs are not that intelligent. Um, so that's what we're talking about. Things are universal, things that let people with disabilities um, move about independently. Uh, and again, this includes, so far we've included the more mainstream, just known kind of disabilities, so blindness, deafness, and needing to use a wheelchair. But there are others. And this is, so I said before, there's a postmodern insight about liminality, and I think that this is very useful here as well. Not just for someone who's, let's say, healthy for a 70-year-old, but is still a boomer, but rather people who have, let's say, chronic pain. And this is the blog post of the world. I mean, I interviewed, let me not say interviewed, I talked to 11 people about it. I believe one of the 11, Chris Pangelian, who I think at this point worked for Uber at the time. Chris was having the disability part of transit center, and everyone else I talked to has chronic pain of some kind. And the thing about people with chronic pain is that you can hang out with them for a couple hours, and I don't mean hang out on Zoom. I mean like be active with them in the city and not notice that they're disabled. So the word for it in the community is spoons. I think it's an analogy with hit points in RPGs. Most of the people I talk to are that kind of nerds. Quite a lot of modern language regarding social justice is very deeply and intimately connected with the fandom community. So, for example, where quite a lot of this language evolved, let's say on Tumblr and before that on LiveJournal, this was specifically a fandom space. Um, and they keep threatening on Twitter to have to spend tens of hours researching something for a video about the race veil. But the race veil was, for example, so for example, the race veil is an example of anti-racism in fandom, kind of creating an enormous cultural shift in SFF that kind of presaged cultural shift, often by the same people in the mainstream. For example, Mickey Kendall began. I think Mickey Kendall actually began within fandom. Um, and so anyway, so the point is that you can expand spoons. I mean, you can't expand a lot of spoons every day, but you can expand spoons. And then people can say, I can't meet you right now out of spoons. That's normal. That's normalized. And so access for people with chronic pain is very invisible. And the reason is that there's this kind of bureaucratic assumption that, oh, it's like normal people. It's like normal able-bodied people. And uh, and it's very different actually. Because there are issues of fatigue. Quite a lot of people that I've spoken to don't use transit anymore. They find it too fatiguing, so they drive. They just find it easier to drive. Especially it's true of people whose transit option is a bus. Um, so the people I've spoken to who have this behavior are people who never had an all rail option. For example, Lisa Schweitzer, I think, um, due to intense fatigue from using public transit, would always drive. Um, I think I don't actually know where Lisa lives, so I don't know whether there's a whole Expo line option or something to get to USC. But the buses certainly are an option in that part of LA. They aren't very frequent, but they're an option. But they're too um but they're too painful. Um and again, I've spoken to a bunch of other people, and it's not a universal experience, but it is an experience that buses are painful to ride. More than very, very occasionally, and even if very, very occasionally, one of the people I spoke to um, gets knocked out all day. Gets knocked out for the day if they are on a bus. And so accessibility, so that's kind of really frustrating because for quite a lot of these fatigue issues, the only real answer is to stop using buses and build trains. Trolley buses are better to some extent than diesel buses. It's not for everyone, but for some people. So maybe you do not want to replace trolley buses with. Actually, so you don't want to replace trolley buses with diesels, which is what Boston West did. Now, for separate reasons, you should not do this because it's stupid. Um, Now, for separate reasons, you should also not replace trolley buses with battery electric buses, the way that Moscow did. Um, and but I didn't ask, so I didn't ask anyone if battery electric buses are okay, and the reason is that battery electric buses are very uncommon. So unless I would seek out people from very specific places, I could not get an answer. Uh, but it's something that might be worth looking at. Uh, but um, but in general, you need to stop treating buses and trams as equivalent. They aren't. Buses are not trams. uh, Buses are generally a lot more painful to use. And it might look like something special, but I mean, other users are also more comfortable on trains than on buses. Um, you replace a bus with a streetcar, it's about a factor of 1.4 difference in ridership per Ed Tennyson. That's the name of the person. Has a paper about the rail bias using American data. So the replacement of streetcars with buses in the 50s, and then the replacement of some buses with light rail in the 80s. And he nets out the impact of speed. Because the replacement of the streetcars with buses also made transit slower. The replacement of uh, some buses with light rail was bundled with a bunch of other things that made transit a lot faster. He nets out the speed. Uh, and ride comfort really is a thing. And again, it's universal design because it's useful for everyone. It's just that for people with not a lot of spoons, that's the difference between being able to move around and not being able to move around. And so you want things like better seating, um, or if you're Moynihan Station in New York, seating of any kind. They built a station without any seating in it because they're hostile. It was literally hostile architecture. you want and this is so Born, you were asking me before about cotton Carter. One of the people that I spoke to for the blog post told me that the DC Metro was very good to use when they still had automated driving. It was never driverless, but they had automated driving and was very smooth. And then the ride quality got worse when they went manual after the accident. But independently of that, a handful of stations were difficult to use, and these were the very deep ones. Um, and what they complained about was vertigo from very long escalators. Now, this is very uncommon um, from escalators in general, but I imagine that the study that I saw that looked at escalators and motion sickness assumed an average escalator. So let's say an escalator that only goes one level at a time at a shopping mall, these are very deep. It's something like 50 meters or something, and maybe even more. And that induces vertigo. Elevators also sometimes induce vertigo. So you probably want a station that is shallow and can be and is accessible, probably Berlin U-Bahn style, so stairs and elevator, uh, and maybe you want an escalator at the busier stations as well. But there needs to be a stair option. When we talk about disability accessibility, we usually don't think of stairs as good, but that's because the conversation. I mean, remember the universal symbol of disability is the wheelchair. It is not the spoon. Yeah, the elevator. Yeah, there's also a separate issue that sometimes the elevators suck. I have no idea what they are in Prague. I have no idea what they were in Prague um, 25 years ago. Um, I will tell you that the first time I used an elevator on the subway in New York in 2006, um, there was the smell of urine. It was the smell of urine because the people just casually piss on the elevator and they're not cleaned sufficiently. So you probably generally will want to clean public facilities. Um, I mean, I'm not saying you should be Singapore, but um, you should be Taipei. And I contrast these cities because Singapore spends a lot of effort on making the city look clean and neat. Taipei is not a neat city in any way, shape, or form. It is a very messy city. It is, however, clean city. The elevators do not smell like there's a cholera epidemic. Um, and So we're talking about so notice how I'm talking about things that bother. I'm like this bothers everyone. I mean, like it's pretty normal to be bothered by the smell of urine on an elevator, right? It's not that some kind of special thing. It's like saying, "Oh my God, here's a really special thing that my oppressed minority group requires. We want lower unemployment rates. We also would like." The government to take steps to end the corona crisis. We wish there to be cheaper housing and higher wages. Um, and also, as queers, we want we want there to be a stronger NATO against Putin. You get that all of these things are completely normal things to want, right? I mean, it's not some kind of special thing about anti-hierarchy or anything like that. Um, yeah, but even streets that are for people are that's at least somewhat controversial because there are drivers who think that if you're not in a car, then you are a valid target. But things like public accommodations should be clean. That's like completely consensus. That's completely in the consensus. It's just that it's something that um, I think needs to be understood as something that's very important um, for people who get sensory issues. I mean, not from smell because I don't think it's so. I don't think it's. I don't think there are people who are unusually sensitive. I'm sure there are people who are unusually sensitive to stench, but I don't think that's correlating with any other kind of issues to the point of becoming a serious disability. Whereas other sensory issues do correlate. So there do exist people who get sensory overload from certain places, and that means if the lighting, for example, is too harsh, or if the lighting is too garish, like let's say it's some kind of searchlight that's in your eyes, or if it's blinking and it might induce epilepsy. Um, is New York's inability to clean related to all its other train problems? Yes. Specifically in both I don't know if it's pan-US, but in both New York and San Francisco, cleaning is viewed as a job of last resort. So they like hiring people on parole for that, which doesn't mean these people are bad, or it doesn't mean that they're hiring people in a situation where they can't be fired for doing no work at all. It like exists as a way of re-socializing people and reintegrating people into society rather than as a way of producing clean accommodations, and the result is that there are just no standards. And so they spam workers, but it's essentially kind of workfare. And this is a problem and this is a problem in New York. It's not the only one. There's also this mentality that if public accommodations are nice, then it means that money is being wasted, so you should just cut the cleaning. So it's kind of weird where they're cutting the outcomes of cleaning, but they're not cutting the jobs because the jobs are viewed as important workfare. And this is where the problems are happening in New York and in San Francisco. It's also where I'm comparing to San Francisco sunny vets, which are viewed as failures because they're required to be staffed 24/7 with two people at night, essentially because the city got scared that people were doing drugs there. But in Paris doesn't have any fewer drug problems than San Francisco. It might have less of a homelessness problem, but if it does, I don't think it has less of a homelessness problem than San Francisco did 10 years ago. So the issue in Paris is just that in Paris they realize, okay, this one place is a problem area. Let's clean that a little more often. Everywhere else, the self-cleaning mechanism does not break, and so they're automated. And in San Francisco, it's viewed as an important kind of tool of job creation. Um, so generally, you want public services that are not viewed as job creation. I mean, yeah, the jobs are nice, but you create public services first of all as services. So schools are about education. Public transit is about universal access for the users. Um, Cleaning is about actually clean facilities. Uh, yeah. I mean, there are issues of weird smells with, let's say, industry, uh, but if it doesn't rise to the level of pollution, then whatever. And so the uh, but with actual sensory issues, again, it's something that can happen with sound and with visual cues if they're too much. You also want not to scream at people, and when I say scream, I don't just mean be loud. I mean when you're droning on too much, people tune you out. This is something that a Polish immigrant in Berlin told me that for people who don't speak the language very well, so this immigrant speaks German at this point, but they didn't when they came here. And what they told me was that it's a problem when there are many PSAs, keep your belongings inside at all times. These things, because um, they're very easy to tune out. And so these are things that annoy regular users. Now, if you think like someone who is worried about a lawsuit because nobody warned me that there's going to be theft in the city, pay me $300 million in a class action lawsuit. And when you have chicken shit uh, managers who think about that and not about how nobody likes these public service announcements, and also people who don't speak the language well, tune them out more easily and then learn to tune out also the useful things. the this is where um, so this is also going to introduce some kind of overload. There does exist sensory overload. Some people just get especially overloaded in very crowded places. To some extent, you can't accommodate. I mean, it's city center. There are going to be lots of people there. Deal. But but trying to avoid um, spamming people with visual and auditory information, I think, is really important. So you do want clear announcements. You do want clear visual and auditory cues, but at the same time, you don't want to scream. This, I think, is really important and is very underrated because it comes from kinds of special needs that are not viewed in the mainstream as part of the mainstream of disability. They're also related to other buckets. I mean, in the United States, there's a separate law, the ADA for disability accessibility, and for civil rights, which is Title VI, which is a generation older. So the idea that you can have something that is useful in combination for people with disabilities and for immigrants who speak poor English, that's not really how American managers think because it's separate laws. They don't think, they never say accessibility, by the way, they always say ADA. And likewise, they never talk about specific civil rights issues. They say Title VI. What do we think about train jingles and gay boy noises? I don't know. Um, so the thing is that because most of my interview subjects are American, um, I could not ask very easily about things that exist only outside the United States. So train jingles are not a thing there. Um, no, they do exist elsewhere. In Singapore, for example, uh, in Singapore there is a jingle which goes playing at every station. They don't visually distinguish the stations, but it's the doors are closing kind of sound. Uh, I don't think that exists. I don't remember hearing that anywhere in North America that I've used a train or a bus, so I could not ask about them. I did speak to some to some non-Americans, but again, the bulk of my again, I believe I interviewed 11 people for no this for this post. Uh, One of them is German, the others are American, I believe. Um, and uh, so um, imagine that if it's yeah, it is an Asian yeah the um so so I will say that I'm not bothered by what Singapore is doing, but I would not know if other people were. I will say that Singapore is an incredibly accessible place in public. Now, privately, it really isn't because there's a tendency within architecture in Singapore to have to have steps at the condos. I don't remember if the HDBs. I think the HDBs have step-free access, but sometimes not to every floor. There's this tendency to have HGBs where the elevator only stops every other floor or every third floor. But the MRT is incredibly accessible, and I think it's really useful to look at its standards for example tactile pavements uh, guide for not just tactile pavements but also not just tactile pavements at the edge of a platform, but tactile pavement that guide you throughout the station for legibility for people who are unfamiliar with the script, because Singapore has four official languages and only two of them use a Latin script. Um, And so again, they don't do everything right because they probably should have shallower stations in Singapore, and by probably I mean definitely. They just copied the British idea of building deep stations. They laundered it as civil defense because Singapore pretends that it has a military. I mean, it doesn't pretend. Singapore is one of the most militarized states in the world, but Singapore pretends that militarization will protect it, uh, when it's in fact an indefensible city state. But the but for, let's call it, the mainstream disabilities, I think it is, as far as I can tell, doing a very good job. Yes, I know. Yeah, yes, you tried. And what Singapore learned from that experience is, other people will not protect us. We can only protect ourselves, rather than, we're a country of 600 something square kilometers. We're comparably sized to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is indefensible and only exists because Maoist China is making is, for whatever reasons, keeping the deal with Britain and letting Hong Kong exist. Uh, and so Singapore has one of the world's highest levels of military spending per capita, and constant propaganda posters about this, and civil, and it makes every underground MRT station, I believe, a nuclear shelter or something. Um, it's this is your country on 1950s, right? Um, yeah, so right, but I mean, Singapore is not. I mean, Singapore is not as, I don't know, in urban farming as, um, let's say, American cities. I mean, like, it's not like there's nothing, will never have real agriculture. But it doesn't. But it's not. But if anything, American cities, I think, subsidize more urban gardening because they pretend that agriculture is inherently moral. And what about the self-reliance and community gardens? And let's ruralize the city because cities are bad, and only immigrants and queers want to live in cities. And so in Singapore, the mentality is that the city is not for the immigrant or the queer. I mean, it is for the immigrant as long as the immigrant stays in the migrant worker dorms and gets corona and knows their place. It is certainly not for the queer. And instead, they have actual public facilities. Again, with the extra 1950s brain bullshit. But at any rate, so what you want is to do things that offer options. So things like stairs, escalator, elevator, um, or auditory cues, visual cues. You want to number the stations. Um, it gets to the point where, when we think about universal design, we're thinking about universal things that are not just about disability, or not just about disability or disability adjacent things, like, oh, right, people with strollers, or pregnant women, or or travelers with heavy luggage. Yeah, they can also use the same infrastructure we're building for people with disabilities. I mean, something broader than that. I mean, disability, but also just niceness of accommodations, or disability and um, immigration and what it means about language skills. Um, it's a bunch of these things at once, and this is, I think, a really important mode of thinking. And again, it's not earth-shattering. It's not something that only exists in obscure critical theory departments. It doesn't. It's something that is increasingly the mainstream of um, thinking about disability, at least in North America. And I'm not sure about Europe. I mean, Europe is clearly doing the right things when it comes. I mean, not France, but most of Europe is sort of clearly moving in that direction about the infrastructure. But I haven't talked to the people who are actually building it, and therefore I cannot tell you the theory behind it. Maybe they think in terms of universal design. Maybe they just think, oh, maybe they just think of, huh, elevators are neat. I have no idea. Again, uh, I haven't spoken about this with the people in, let's say, Berlin or Barcelona or Madrid or Milan. Um, and uh, and so the um, So the stuff that's more marginal, unfortunately, is chronic pain. I mean, there's still not a lot of understanding of chronic pain. I think it's going to change this decade, and the reason is long COVID. So I read, let me actually check this. Long COVID. Let me see if you can see. Educated. Let me see. So I read that. So this might actually be a good example of this. But I'm not gonna find this way. Educated. Let me try middle class, but it's not gonna work this way because I read this in American articles, and in America, middle class means not what not, does not mean middle class. Uh, no, not gonna help. No, I'm not gonna meet them. I don't want to die. Um, but anyway, so what I read is that long COVID is disproportionately a disease of the educated middle class. Is it because it is disproportionately affecting the educated middle class? Absolutely not. It is because, remember what I said at the beginning that people with disabilities have long learned the medical system is adversarial to them? This is especially true of chronic pain. Like, I literally went a couple of years ago to this feminist book reading. I think it was Blue Stockings in New York about in which a woman was talking about her pain and how at work everyone thought she was malingering, whereas, for example, a man who had been injured in a skiing accident uh, received nothing but sympathy. Um, and so, likewise, doctors have this tendency to disbelieve patients' pain, especially if they're women, especially if they're in the United States black. It's actually a pretty big thing that doctors underrate black pain in the United States. It's also a pretty universal thing. I think that doctors underplay female pain. Uh, and so, and I imagine it's class, but it's not as, but it hasn't been investigated much, or it hasn't, or it's hard to, it's usually hard to exactly define because usually if you're in so much pain you can't work, then you don't have much of an income either way. So you need to start sociologically defining class in a different way. But but anyway, the situation is that with long COVID, because so post-viral syndrome is something that was very underrated and understudied. Stephen Smith, by the way, has had it for years. Stephen Smith has post-viral fatigue, I think since I want to say 17 or 18 is when he got it. And nobody believed him. Um, because that was not supposed to be a thing. And now people are saying, oh, that's a thing because of Corona and because of long COVID. And again, because people still disbelieve people's pain, this is something that is seen more in the sort of people who doctors believe more, and the sort of people who can push doctors into believing them. Uh, but it's much broader than this. Long COVID symptoms, and the upshot is that I think that in the future, and I don't mean in the future 30 years from now, I mean in the future 5 years from now, there's going to be a lot more social understanding of how to how to do the kind of accommodations I'm speaking of regarding issues of physical fatigue and pain. Not sensory issues, unfortunately. I imagine sensory issues will remain marginalized, which is bad. But stuff about chronic pain, about chronic physical pain, I imagine that things are going to get better in terms of accommodations, just because things got so horrific in terms of um, the sheer number of people who have right now have a debilitating chronic condition owing to the inability or not inability, I should not say inability, owing to the unwillingness of North America and Europe to learn a single fucking thing from the Republic of China. Uh, which I just checked this morning. I believe they had 12, I think 11 cases. today, 11 domestic cases, um, have Omicron. And and so the and so so again, so it's guidelines that somehow look weird because I'm talking about vertigo and suddenly stairs might be an answer. But okay, yeah, I have options. Some people prefer elevators, some escalators, some stairs. Offer these options. Um, Offer queues. Um, It doesn't mean you should be offering different kinds of buses, by the way, because once you're split. So note that I'm talking about options that are very easy to offer. But maybe it costs a couple million euros per station to build elevators, but it's a couple million euros per station. Um, but stuff. But the problem is when you start um segregating the market is when things get bad. Like if you're trying to say, oh well, for able-bodied people, we'll have buses with longer stop spacing. For elderly people and for people with disabilities, we'll have buses with shorter stop spacing. No, you can't do that. I mean, you can. You'll just have half the frequency on each type of service, and it's going to wreck your ridership. So you want to have one compromised stop distance. I will note something. Out of all the people that I talked to, I asked them about walking to the bus. Um, One of them had a problem. That's Alan Rosen, aka Brooklyn Bus. Um, and he talks about his sciatica as a sciatica. Sciatica? Fuck that. Sciatica. Um, and the and the other people I talked to with chronic pain walk to the subway. They don't need to only walk 200 meters to a bus stop. Or with scoliosis, same thing. And and the so yeah, you want to have one stop spacing, for example. You don't want to, or you don't want to have too much separation between buses and trains, uh, because you want to concentrate frequency because frequency is really important. But you want good amenities. Um, Again, public bathrooms, self-cleaning ones because you don't want to spend horrific amounts of money on attendants and on cleaners. You want but you want different kinds of information because it's easy to offer that without splitting your market. Uh, and this is, I think, how universal design is going to work. And always remember, universal design is not just about issues of disability or disability adjacent things, also disability in language, um, disability in poverty. Um, Things that are not exactly intersectional. It's not. I'm not saying, okay, what about people who are both categories? No, I'm saying quite the opposite. I'm saying, what about people in? How are you going to figure out how to build universal design for people who might be in one of two categories without necessarily intersecting them? Kind of, I guess, in the sense that if you pass strong anti-discrimination laws, they're not intersectional. I mean, they're not gonna. I mean, they could be because they're gonna prevent discrimination against black women or especially here with the way Europe treats the hijab, it would be against Muslim women. But certainly not in the American way. In the American way, if you pass strong disability, not disability, anti-discrimination laws, then yeah, you're gonna. It's that in the same kind of equal pay law, in the same kind of system of equal pay, you're going to protect women regardless of race, and you're going to protect racial minorities regardless of gender. Um, and 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 I think it's useful to look for universal design elements. But again, it's me harping on kind of Asian style station numbering, having maybe different colors, different thematic colors for stations, things like that, as a means of distinguishing stations in ways that are helpful to broad classes of people. So in this case, it would be deaf people. It would be people who don't speak the language well. It would also be people it would also be, let's say, tourists, occasional visitors who are not tourists, regular users who are not using the line that they're used to using. Or maybe people go to a different neighborhood, especially in a very large city. I mean, you think I memorized the entire Berlin U-Bahn? No, I didn't. I mean, considering the topology of this system, sure. I don't think I would be able to label every intersection point though. It's not Vancouver. In Vancouver, I think I might actually be able to draw you not quite the entire SkyTrain system, but most of it. Certainly all the important stations. But Berlin, no, it's too big. So it's the same thing. So it's lots of classes of users, often classes of users that are covered by different equality laws. On the basis of gender, on the basis of on the basis of race, on the basis of uh, age, on the basis of disability, um, and also people who don't fall into any of these protected classes, but might have luggage or might be really wiped today and not be very alert and want to be semi alert and still make their stop. Um, and so this is the importance, I think, of universal design. So it's about making sure you have independent mobility, but also independent mobility in a way that um, lets you essentially that lets you use the same facilities broadly as everyone else, rather than being a little bucket where the market is so thin that you have to rely on this kind of paratransit van that costs deluxe amounts of money um, to actually run, but then gives you hellish service in which it's not even in which it's door to door, but it's door to door with detours, and these detours are long, and these detours are often on side streets. So if the van maneuvers around, you're going to get motion sick in the back of the car. I mean the van, but same thing. Um, and it's in the and you get this half-hour window. It's very so you want to avoid this kind of humiliation and create essentially one system that through these kind of tweaks uh, works for everyone. This is essentially what universal design means in this context. Um, and I think I'm going to stop here and take questions if anyone has any on this issue or on adjacent issues. And you see how there's this backlighting? It's because it's the um, it's a phone thing. As I said, I have a very white phone, so I mean, it's only an hour and a half. It's on the short side. This stream. What would be my advice to London? Um, London might be special. But I will ask London what their best practices people are saying about what Madrid, uh, Milan, and Barcelona are doing about their accessibility programs. Again, Berlin's going to be a little different, um, but certainly whatever Madrid and Barcelona and Milan are doing is going to port very cleanly to the entire subsurface system. Again, the tube might be a little bit different, but certainly not the subsurface lines. And when these people stare at me, so you tell these people these comparison cities, and then when they stare at you like you're a lunatic for daring suggest that London has anything to learn from another city, let alone a continental city, uh, you ask them why they think London shouldn't learn. It's a big problem in London that they refuse to learn. I mean, even from things that are very similar. I got yelled at on Twitter um, when I suggested that perhaps London can learn something from Parisian automation, and and the costs thereof. Apparently, there's like the problem is also Britain has so little transparency that that they can just say it is going to cost us 11 quadrillion long style British quadrillion pounds to do so, and no, you can't see the data unless you send us a specific freedom of information request in which you need to query the entire to query the exact thing to ask, and we can redact, and we're going to redact much of the information because we went to Oxbridge and you didn't, pleb. Yeah, they spike things, and they spike things. There's just very poor transparency in Britain and in the United States in comparison with Italy, let alone Sweden. Like people think, like, I mean, this is one of my hobby horses about this, that people think that Italy is run by the mafia. No, it doesn't. Italy has very specific corruption problems coming from the fact that people don't pay taxes. Although even that is being cracked down on because Italians actually understand what the problems of Italy are. Oh, the DFT, the DFT snobs are. The TFL might be, I think, like half a notch below the below Dom and his clique. Uh, but it's still, the sort of people who think they're superior to normal users, which is not an attitude that they've ever encountered here. DFT is, I mean, DFT is also not people or transport experts because they get rotated between things. But anyway, like in London, again, the tube might be different, and the reason is that very few other cities built deep level lines before modern standards became a thing. Like DC, for example, was built deep from the start, which was very unusual at the time. But DC, even though it was well before the ADA, it was still with a more modern, by which I mean post 1960s understanding of accessibility. So it was built accessible from the start. And so London might have more legacy issues. I'm not sure. Certainly, but it doesn't have any on the. What are the accessibility implications of PEDs? They're great. They're amazing. PEDs are amazing. These are platform edge doors. For people who don't know the abbreviation, that means that instead of accidentally falling onto the tracks or jumping onto the tracks or being pushed onto the tracks, there's going to be glass doors between you and the tracks, and if they go all the way up, there's something called platform screen doors as opposed to platform edge doors, and then you can also have an air conditioner at the station, and it's not going to leak to the tunnels. This is a really based innovation. I do not know how much it costs except in Paris, where it was what is 4 million euros per station. These are small stations. If you're in New York, I think you need to double that. But or less than double that, I'm not sure. But but they're a really good idea. Um, you definitely want these to. Uh, so the accessibility implication is mostly that people are just not gonna fall. Period. This is a platform. This is even in London. This is Crossrail. So yeah, this is what you want your station to look like. Uh, and note that because it's a new build, it goes all the way up, which means I imagine it's London, so they're not doing it. But in a place that gets warmer than London, this could be air conditioned and would not leak to the tunnel. So yeah, really good. I mean, there are implications for accessibility. I guess it's really useful to air condition things in public to avoid heat stroke, which is something that disproportionately affects elderly people, which is how France has a finite life expectancy. It's so there. So the reason. So France has finite life expectancy for three reasons, right? They have actually four reasons. They have rather bad air pollution in Paris from the diesel. That's thankfully getting better, just not very fast. They smoke like chimneys. That's also getting better, thankfully. The stuff they eat is horrific. Like all they eat is butter, and every couple summers, all the elderly people die of heat stroke because in Northern Europe nobody has air conditioning. So you probably want more air conditioning as a as a mitigation measure. It's also, I think, understood that in that senior centers exist to specifically make sure that, for example, elderly people can have access to drinking water. Um, because you might stay at home and not notice that you're getting heat stroke until it's too late. And so the so air conditioning, I think, is also something that is useful to some extent. The one thing that I kind of want to caution is that it's um yeah, so you could also do things that don't involve. So ideally, you want to avoid air conditioning, and the reason is not electricity consumption. The reason is that air conditioning um, can trigger migraines. Because I think it's something to do with the fact that there's not enough air exchange. But my understanding is that is that it's better to have solutions that are not um, air conditioning, unless if they can be kept down to comparable levels of noise, because stuff like fan noise is a problem. Um, so I think this is the trade-off between standards, where you definitely want ways to cool down the station, uh, using air conditioning if you have to, but ideally you want to have other things. By the way, platform edge doors kill that completely, because often it's a piston effect involving the trains. But platform edge doors have too many other benefits, I think. And again, you can always, I mean, if they go all the way up, then you have a stable space. Are there more questions? So by the way, I experimented on this before we started recording. I have a 5 second lag, I believe. So if I'm speaking, then I see what is American owned countries on best practices? I have no idea. And the reason I have no idea is that, especially for issues of chronic pain, because nobody thinks this way, everything is going to be sporadic, and I can talk about standards, but I am uncomfortable saying Singapore is good for people with chronic pain because they've not asked people with chronic pain how accessible Singapore is on this. And it's possible that they've missed something. Um, so, for example, I have no idea what the ride quality on the buses there is, because from my perspective, buses just have bad ride quality, and I cannot easily distinguish this in this place. I can rely on the bus in this place. I can't, because I just make sure to not need to use the bus and take trains. Um, if that makes sense. And also, even within the same country, there might be big differences. The United States has very large internal differences between Boston and Chicago, uh, both of which are pretty accessible, at least on the subway, and New York, which is a horror show. I think Philadelphia is more like New York. Maybe it's a bit better than New York. I'm not sure. And then you get things like countries that are just new. I mean, Singapore did it right from the start, as far as I can tell. Um, but stuff like retrofits of HDBs in Singapore, that doesn't happen very much, and especially in Singapore, it's also usually bundled with demands of political loyalty. So they specifically underinvest in HDBs in areas that dare vote for the opposition. Um, Now that's public housing and not public transit, but housing and transportation are intimately related. And I don't remember the full list, but multiple democracies merged them into one ministerial portfolio. Again, I don't remember which one. I want to say maybe Sweden or the Netherlands, like maybe one or the other, but I don't remember which one. Shock. So sorry, I could not answer the question. It's just too many different factors. Oh, and I will also add one more reason I'm not answering the question. Um, Dealing with an unfamiliar environment costs spoons. And this means that two otherwise identical people with chronic pain, one in let's say one is American and one is French. The American is going to find Paris much less accessible than, let's say, Boston. And I imagine the French one will have the exact opposite of me. Or France versus New York. But let's say it's someone with, I mean, and I'm not, and yes, and I don't know two such people. I know the case of an American comparing French with the United States. Just the dealing with with an unfamiliar environment is very stressful, especially when in a different language. And this means that asking these kind of like just asking people for their impression to compare two countries is gonna is not going to be a very it's not going to lead to very good answers on this unless it's someone who has lived extensively in several of them. Um, and even and remember, migration is selected for spoons, so that's already going to be a not very clean sample. I mean, I guess the best thing, like if you're trying to like ask one person for their impression, is to get someone who, let's say, moved in a few places, got long COVID, um, and then ask how with long COVID they're finding these different places, how they compare, right? Because the history of up until long COVID is many spoons, familiarity with multiple places, and then post long COVID they still have the familiarity. Um, so this is why it's a question that I'm saying is like I'm giving you a lot of answers about why it's not possible to answer this question. Um, I mean, I shouldn't say not possible. I can't with the knowledge that I have. I don't know if the knowledge has even been produced. It certainly can be. It requires, I mean, it requires pretty heavy ethnography, but it's ethnography that doesn't even require anything as ridiculous as like doing these two-way comparisons with long COVID. I mean, but it requires pretty extensive ethnographic research, and I don't mean 11 interviews. I mean triple digits. Are there other questions? Right, right. There are no PPP dollar benchmarks. I mean, I can tell you which countries build elevators more cheaply than others, but even that is, I mean, there's the cost of an elevator. It's 2 million euros, give or take. It's pretty similar across different places. And then, I mean, in Paris, they claim the costs are higher, but in Paris they're spiking it because they don't want to build it because they hate people with disabilities. In London, I'm perfectly willing to buy that they're just incompetent and they don't know that things can be done for cheaper. Um, United States probably a combo, especially New York. Although it was told in New York, it's not. In New York, they're not spiking. In New York, they're just horrific. They're just horrifically bad at all kinds of public investments and like literally all of the reasons, like utilities, procurement, things like that, that make subways horrifically expensive, also make elevators horrifically expensive. It's the same problem, but that's there, and we're in Europe where we have no social problems whatsoever. Um, all we have no social problems whatsoever. All problems are because of immigration and the fact that other people are different from us and they're not and they're introducing social problems to us, and this is very sad. But we must endure this. We must endure these things or something. And I guess in Germany, you can also say all, or you can also start blaming problems on Southern Europe. It's pretty popular to pretend here that somewhere that people pretend that all Muslims are criminals, that people pretend that all Southern Europeans are lazy. all Eastern Europeans are homophobes or anti-Semites. Are there other questions? Anyway, I'm gonna try. I mean, I don't know if you can cut this at 150. And also, these numbers are slightly off as always, but I think I'll be sticking around. Anyway, if there are no more questions, then thanks for joining, even on a topic that's somewhat different from my usual very crowny fare. And I will see you probably next week, not sure, with another video, as always, on the topic to be determined. So thank you, and